Hello and welcome back to part 4 and the final part in this reality series on how to draw human portraits with charcoal. Alright, now we're going to jump right into what I feel like is one of the most important parts of a portrait, which is the eye. Now since we're seeing this from the side, it means we have less detail to work with, which is a good thing because it means we don't have to draw as much. Now the downside to that is that the detail we put in has to really count, because we're putting in like half the detail that we'd normally put into a normal eye from a head-on position. So what I'm doing here is I'm taking extra soft charcoal and I'm doing the darkest parts of the eyes first. Now if you're not comfortable diving straight into the darkest parts, if you like to start light and then get darker as you go, by all means do that. But what I'm doing is I've added the darkest parts because I'm comfortable with it, and to me, once I get those dark parts in, I can work my way out from that. If you're a beginner or even like intermediate, what I would do first here is probably lay in the gray tones that happen in the whites of her eye, and that way you can overlap the eyelashes into that. But what I'm doing is I'm laying in the eyelashes first, top and bottom, and then I'm going to lay in her pupil and iris. And the thing about this particular one is, since it's from the side instead of being, face on, basically it boils down to her iris and pupil being one big almond-shaped splotch of gray, and that's about it. Now this does mean that we need to get the angle and the positioning exactly right. So if we get this off by even so much as a millimeter or two, let's say on the top, let's say we add too much pencil to the top, it's not going to look like she's looking at the lipstick and the lips. It's going to look like she's looking at the nose or the eyes. And so that positioning in relation to the rest of the opening and the whites of her eye, that needs to be on the money. So really take your time here and make sure that your shapes and your angles are right on. The darkness and the lightness, those areas of tone and contrast, we can manipulate those later and get those the way we want them, but the shapes are absolutely the most important part here. Now remember that we don't really want to make the eyelashes as, we're not drawing individual hairs here. That's what makes things look cartoony and kind of comic book when we're simplifying an eyelash into a single stroke. So what we're doing is we're drawing the eyelashes as basically its own very dark shadow, and even the individual hairs that we're drawing, we're going to go back over with a blending stump, and we're going to take out pencil marks and kind of fuzz those up just a tiny bit. We don't want those to be super sharp. We need them to be sharp enough to be in focus, but really whenever you're looking at eyelashes on a drawing, a painting, a photograph, those things don't jut out as individual hairs unless the artist or the photographer is trying to make a point and make those really the focal point of the piece. Even then, if the photograph or the piece of artwork is showing individual hairs, it means that it's really, really focused on just that one part, and you're likely going to get the rest of the drawing and photograph that becomes blurry along the edges. On ours, we don't want to do that. We want the eyelashes to be just a little bit fuzzy, and we're going to blend those out. And then what I'm going to do is kind of pull the soft charcoal of the eyelashes into the whites of her eye so that we can darken that up a bit. The whites of the eyes are almost never pure white. They're almost always a fairly dark, like a mid-tone type of gray. We only think of them as white because in reality, when we're looking in color, the whites of the eyes appear white in contrast to and in comparison to the rest of the surroundings. But in black and white, we can actually see the shadows that overlay that whites of the eye, and so it becomes a darker gray. You can see here that I'm really taking my time to make sure that these eyelashes are correct too. Because we're working in such a small area and there's not much room for detail, the details that I do put in have to be pretty precise. I don't need them to be exact. I don't need to be 100% duplication of the reference photo. But I do need the shapes to be correct. I need to make sure that the eyelashes that dip into the whites of the eye and cover, parts of the pupil, I need to make sure that in the most basic terms, they stay pretty on point. If we go too long with those, then the eyelashes look, goofy and exaggerated, and we don't really want an exaggerated look here. Now I've grabbed a bunch of brand new Q-tips here because I don't, the Q-tips that I've been using, as you use them, they become fluffier and fuzzier and they cover more of an area. When you get a brand new Q-tip, they're wound tighter. And so you can start blending in a much more confined and restricted area with a brand new one. So what I've done is I've taken a brand new Q-tip and I've dirtied it up with extra soft charcoal from my scrap paper. And we're going to be laying in, there's two things that happen here. One is makeup and the other is shadow. And so we have to make sure that those things are combined in a way that when we get done with this drawing, it doesn't all look like just shadows. We need to be able to tell at least a little bit that she's wearing a smoky looking eye makeup. So I'm adding that in on the tops and the bottom, and I'm purposely laying it in much lighter than what it needs. I want the general idea of it to be there, and then once we get more of her face done, then we can compare and contrast what we've done, what we're doing right now to what we will be doing, which is the cheeks, the shadows, and all that, and the hair. And then those things will start to pop out as needing darkened. It's much, much easier to do that once we have more of the drawing laid in than to try to guess what it should look like right now and hope we're correct later down the line. I'd always rather lay in stuff too light and darken later. It's just so much easier. Keep in mind when we're doing reflections like this in like the ball of the eye, the white of the eye, keep in mind that the light source that is in this drawing and in the original photograph is dead on. Meaning that if you look, I've mentioned this a couple times, but if you look at the hair on the girl on the left, there's a strip of light that goes right in the middle of her hair horizontally. And you can follow that light as it goes into the top of her cheek and then across her nose. That's that dead center light. Everything gets darker as you go from there up, and it gets darker as you go from there down. We need to mimic that in the white of the eye. So on the woman on the right, you'll be able to see that the whites of the eye gets darker as it goes up and to the left, and it gets darker as you go down and to the right, meaning that the very center of that, the white of the eye, is much brighter. And I've even taken a Tombow eraser and put in a little dot of pure white there to show the reflection of whatever happens to be in front of them. It's probably a window or something like that. But it gives it more of a glassy, wet look to it than if we just did it with plain, grays and then didn't add that little dot of reflection. You can see me carrying this on too as we go from the ridge of her eye and work our way up. It's going to get darker toward the eye because One, there's shadows, and two, there's makeup. But the important part here, I believe that's more important than the actual makeup itself, is as we go up from that ridge on the eye and the upper eyelash, the shading gets lighter because her eye curves there. The bottom part of her forehead and the around the eyebrow, it curves toward the camera. Therefore, it's going to reflect and catch more light, so we need to lighten up as we go toward the apex of that curve. Then whenever we get past that, we can start adding a little bit of darkness and go from light to dark as we go up into the forehead. And that way it won't look like her face is flat. It gives it the illusion that it curves. The eyebrow here that I'm working on now is a little on the difficult side because the eyebrows have been groomed. They have probably a little bit of makeup on them. And the individual hairs that exist in the eyebrows aren't super noticeable. This is more like a shadow. We're going to treat it more like a shadow than an eyebrow. We're going to kind of splotch that in with a pencil like a mass. And then we're going to blend that out with a blending stump. To make it look more like an eyebrow that has individual hairs, we can kind of cheat that in there. We will color this in with the blending stump and smooth everything together. But occasionally, very sporadically, we'll leave little open areas where we can see the skin behind the eyebrow. And that will create the illusion that there's a separation of hair there. So by the time we're done, even though we're not drawing in individual hairs, we'll be able to recognize that as an eyebrow right off the bat because we have these very small, thin areas where lighter areas poke through it. It was almost the same thing on the original girl that we drew on the left. Hers is done in a mass like that, but her hair's lighter and thinner, so we did a few more individual hairs very, very lightly with a pencil. This one, we're dealing with a woman with very dark hair. She's done more grooming to her eyebrows. Age has made the hairs thicken up a little bit. And so we can get away with more of a drawn-on look instead of, little swipes and individual hairs. We can get away with more of like a solid colored-in line. Now with a dirty Q-tip, I'm going to go back up to the top of her head and we're going to start filling in a much larger section of this, the face and the skin. And you've heard me talk before about wanting to get more of the paper filled in to help our motivation. So the more of this skin I get dropped in right now, the more it feels like this drawing is being completed. So you notice I didn't spend a ton of time on that eye. I got the basic idea of the eye put in place. Then I'm going to jump up and start dropping in some of the skin tones. Then we can go back and refine that later. So like right now, what I'm doing is I'm making this purposely much darker at the top compared to the skin on the left. Because the woman's skin is a little darker than the girl's skin anyway. And I want to make sure that I get that aspect of it put in right off the bat. Now we're going to go back in at some point and darken this even more. But for right now, all I want to do is add in the darkness of her skin, fill in as much paper as we can fill in, and then move on to something else. That way we can get more of the drawing done, we get more motivated, the finish line gets closer and closer, and we can see that this drawing is going to be wrapped up soon. in almost all drawings, it's going to start getting darker around the eyes because the forehead and the eyebrow area curves inward, and therefore it drops more shadows. Keep that in mind when you're doing any portrait. If you got an eye that for some reason looks like it's drawn on just flat gray paper, it's almost always going to be because your shadows around the eyes, and especially leading into the eyebrow area and the nose area, are not dark enough. So you haven't created the illusion of curve and depth. When we get more and more of this laid in, you'll see what I mean as we go back into that eye area and into the bridge of the nose, and we start really laying in some way darker areas in comparison to the other parts of the skin, and the skin will begin to look like it rolls, like it has hills and valleys. When you see me going back with a Tombow eraser here, I'm not necessarily adding highlights. What I'm doing is I've gone a little bit too overboard with the Q-tip. And sometimes it's not even going overboard. Sometimes what it is I've got too much charcoal in one area of the Q-tip, so it's not spread evenly. So one part of what I'm shading will come off a little darker than the rest. So to lighten that up, instead of using a kneaded eraser, I just take the Tombow eraser, and as lightly as I can possibly do it, I'm barely touching just that area that I want to lighten up. And that's a skill set that you'll probably need to practice to pull off, because if you put too much pressure on that, it will pull off too much charcoal, and now instead of lightening that down and blending it out and evening it out with the rest of the skin around it, you're going to erase too far, and it's going to look like a big bright white reflection. Now I'm starting to work where the eye curves into the nose, and remember, her cheeks will be closer to the camera than her nose will be. So there's two hills that we're working on there. There's the hill that dips down and then back up again along the bridge of her nose, along the top of it. Then as the bridge of the nose rolls into and slopes into the cheek, the face comes back out again because the cheek puffs outward. So these are the slopes that we're taking great care on to make sure that they have the shadows in the right places. And we also need to make sure that the shadows have the right contrast between the rest of the face that we're putting in. If we're not careful here and the shadows have too defined of an edge on them, it will look like we just drew the cheek with an edge and it just stops, and then the nose will be there and it just stops, and those will be two separate entities. If we do that, it can actually make the person that you're drawing look fat, because to the viewer, the cheek will roll over and then drastically cut into the bridge of the nose, which should suggest that it's bulbous and it comes out further than the rest of the face. So we need to be careful here that there's rolls and slopes, but we don't have big swooping defined edges on those shadows, and they need to be very subtle and blend outward. Trust me, when you're doing a commission or you're drawing another person just for, a favor or just because you want to, the last thing you want to do is add 10 or 20 pounds worth of weight to that person. They will be offended as all get out. So make sure that your shadows are correct, especially whenever you're doing a portrait like this where we're seeing the faces from the side. Now this area is where a lot of people make mistakes. When we get to the edge of the nose, the instinct of most people is to draw a line along the edge of the nose, where the nostrils are and also to the side of that nose. That defines that edge and gives it a very, very hard shadow. So if your shadow has a lot of very harsh lighting, then yes, that can kind of work. You still need to smooth out the edges and blend it and fuzz the edges of that shadow, even if it's just slightly. But when you're doing something like this, the shadows are way more subtle. We don't want to draw anything on the nose. Everything needs to be done with a Q-tip, and those shadows need to roll into each other. Everything flows. If we were to draw the edge of the nose in on this one, and this area where the cheek rolls in to where you get the mouth lines and stuff like that, if we were to draw those in with a pencil, it would be a completely different lighting than the rest of the drawing, and it would look out of place and really weird. Now we can go back into the nose and very, very lightly add in one strip of, I wouldn't even say I'm drawing a line here. I barely touch the pencil to the paper in the darkest part of the nostril. Then what I can do is I can take the blending stump and start blending that darkest part and then blend outward from there so that the paper picks up more and more charcoal and cleans the blending stump more and more. That means that the strokes that I'm using with a blending stump automatically become lighter as I scrub these new, a little bit more defined shadows along the edges of the nose. And look how much better the edge and the bottom of this nose look by using a blending stump and fading inward and outward from that line than what you would have if I just took hard or extra soft charcoal and drew a defined line there. As I'm doing this nose, I just keep thinking to myself, keep it soft, keep it subtle, and make it flow. So a lot of times I think a lot of beginning artists think that you draw an eye, then you draw a nose. And technically, I mean, they're right. But your perspective on this as an artist and the way you think of this in your own brain really helps if you think of the eye as not a single standalone entity here, but it flows in a way where as you go down, it slowly becomes the nose. And as the nose, the shadows come out of there and form the cheek, the nose becomes the cheek, it becomes the lips. One thing flows into the other. And so I never really think about drawing just an eye. I never think about drawing just a nose. I continue from that thing that I drew. If I happen to be thinking of the nose as an entity, I continue drawing outward, and before I know it, suddenly there's a mouth and cheeks there. If I can keep myself in that frame of mind where I'm thinking of things as flowing, then my shadows are going to continue to flow in the correct way. They don't stop in an area and then start in another, and it doesn't look like you sort of gridded it out and took one thing one little square at a time. Everything is like a river. It always flows together and blends into each other and forms an overall entity that's cohesive. I'm taking great care on the lips here. I'm starting out with a blending stump just to get the outline of the lips basically correct, and then we can go in and start darkening that up here in just a bit. And the reason I'm doing that is because of the same reason we took a lot of care with the eye. We're seeing this from the side, so every stroke of the pencil and every stroke of the blending stump matters. And it matters at least double what it would normally do because we're cutting the surface that we're drawing in half. So every bend, every shadow, every ridge needs to be really, really close to the original photo. So my basic plan for most of this area is to drop in the basic skin tone with a Q-tip. Then we can go back and draw in I don't really want to say draw in, but we're dropping in finer point shadows with a blending stump. That keeps the shadows a little bit more defined, but they're not so defined that they look like we drew them in with a pencil. They still need to fade. But it allows us to be precise with those strokes, and we can keep the shadows at least confined enough to where when we glance at this drawing, or even really when we study the drawing after it's done, we can tell the cheek ends here and starts swooping into like the upper lip. Now I'm working on the lips using the opposite technique of the eye. I'm starting light and slowly getting darker. In doing it this way, I've got more control. I can build up layers, and then if I happen to mess it up, it's not quite as difficult to fix. If I end up getting the lips off by a few millimeters on either the top or bottom ridge, and then there's a third ridge right in the middle where the two lips meet, if I get those off even slightly, it changes the look of her face, and now she will look like a completely different person because it will change the whole shape of her mouth. So for that reason, I'm making sure I start light and then get darker as I go, because right now I'm more worried about shape than I am contrast and tone and lightness and darkness and all that. At this point in doing the mouth, you can actually modify things a bit by doing very, very slight adjustments. So if you want to make it look like she's closer to smiling, all you have to do is go to the right hand corner of that mouth and curve that upward just like a millimeter. It doesn't have to be much at all. That slight curve upward will make it appear like she's smiling. If you want to make it look like she's concentrating more, then all you have to do is curve that downward. And again, only like a millimeter or two, and that slight adjustment will completely change her expression. There's one area here where one curl, like a rogue curl, comes out and almost covers her mouth. It goes right up to the bottom lip in the corner of her mouth. We have to remember that those curls cast more defined shadows than the rest of the face. So what I'm doing is I'm quickly adding these in with a Q-tip to make sure that I don't forget that these curls are casting these shadows. The more practical reason that I'm doing this, just outside of memory, is it's easier for me to blend those shadows upward into the curls. Then I can just shade over the top of the little fuzzy overlaps later, and it won't show through. It's easier for me to do that than to add very dark curls with extra soft charcoal and then try to blend the shadows up to that. Because if I cross over from the face to the curls with a Q-tip, I'm going to pick up very, very black charcoal, and it's going to be very easy for me to accidentally streak that hair out into the skin. And that's way harder to fix than it is for me to just drop in the background first and then use a charcoal to just shade right over the top of it. Now I can start to see that finish line a little bit more clearly. So I'm going to drop in much more of her face and her cheeks and stuff. Then I can go back into it with a dirtier Q-tip and start darkening up the edges where the face rounds and starts to go a little further away from the camera and more into the hair. I'm starting to work on the shadows that her cheeks cast overall as like more like shading a sphere. And then I can go back and add more defined shadows where hairs drop over the top of it and where the cheeks aren't a perfect sphere. They've got little dips and valleys in them. I can refine those later. But my biggest thing here was just getting the skin tone in and getting the overall shadow of the cheek first. And now the drawing starts to take a whole lot more shape and more of it's done, so that finish line just keeps getting closer and closer. Right now, I'm as worried about my own motivation as I am the details of the drawing. It's very, very easy to burn yourself out when you're shading over large blocked out areas like this because it's a tedious process. If you find yourself getting burnout and you need more motivation, switch to something else to draw, like on the same drawing. Don't just put your drawing away and start something new. Just find another area to work on, and that way it kind of refreshes your brain and gives you something new to concentrate on, and that feeling of newness will kind of refresh your motivation, or at least it does for me. I wanted to lighten up this shadow a bit, so I just took my kneaded eraser and I barely touched it to the paper. I pushed down and lifted off. Now sometimes when I want to take a lot more pencil off, I push down and twist. This one I just pushed down and lifted, and then what you'll do is go back over it with either a clean Q-tip or a slightly dirty Q-tip. You don't want to do it with, extra soft charcoal on it, otherwise you'll create the same problem that you just tried to fix. You'll darken it too much. But a clean Q-tip or a very slightly dirty one will fill in the marks that your kneaded eraser just left, because the kneaded eraser will pull off a little too much, and it'll leave areas where it almost looks like a circle. Like the kneaded eraser doesn't fan itself out on the edges and make a gradient. It makes very defined circles where it touches. So all we're doing is just getting rid of those and blending the rest of it together. Then I'm going to bounce back up into the eye because I'm comparing the shadow that I just fixed to the rest of the drawing, and notice the eye needs to darken. At this point, I know that the entire face needs to be darkened. But I'm doing it little bits at a time so that I don't accidentally go overboard and do it too much. At that point, if I do it too much, I'm kind of screwed, because then I would have to lighten the entire face, and that would be a nightmare to try to pull off. The only other way around that is to darken the entire rest of the drawing so that it compares. And that would also be a nightmare, because that would, you're working on 75% of the paper at that point, trying to darken it to match the new skin. Now we're doing what I talk about a lot. We laid in the basics, now we're going to start refining. So I'm going to start darkening up shadows here and there, darkening up little pieces of skin here and there, but I'm not going to go so far as to say I'm putting on finishing touches, because there will be areas where I'll go back and say this entire area needs to come up 50% more in darkness. But this is our first real, first layer of refinement on this face. And I like to start with the more defined shadows so that it starts to pop out more. Getting those shadows correct as quickly as possible will let me look at the rest of the drawing, and by comparison say I'll darken up the skin tone this much in order to match this shadow. You can do it the opposite way. You can darken up the skin tones first and then go back and fix the shadows to match that. This just happens to be the method I'm a little bit more comfortable doing. There's absolutely nothing wrong with changing the order of how you do this, though. Now that I've added these shadows in, especially once I've darkened these in along the bottom of the eye, now I can start to see what looks like a shadow versus what looks like makeup. And I realized as I'm doing this, it doesn't just need to be darkened up. It needs to have a tighter gradient around the top and the bottom of the eyes. So the areas that I'm going to darken quite a bit, and then that's going to quickly fade into the top ridge of the eye and where the eye goes into the bottom of the cheek. And that kind of defines that area of the eye as having makeup rather than just being covered in shadows. But the key to pulling that off is it has to be way darker than the areas that are surrounding it so that it sticks out as smoky eye makeup. Now we can go back into the extra soft charcoal from the scrap paper. I'm going to slightly load up my blending stump and use it as a pencil. We're going to darken up the ridges of the lips along the bottom of the top lip and along the top of the bottom lip. Where those two things meet and where they become the darkest will be like the shape of her mouth. It will be what defines her as having a smile or a serious face. But we're not going to just draw that in just yet. We may go back with a pencil in a bit and darken that up with hard or extra soft charcoal to give it more definition. But for right now, I just want to use the blending stump to put the initial idea of that in there. Now that I've worked on the lips, remember what I told you about motivation. I want more of this done. I want to have way more of the paper covered. Right now, about the only things to do that would cover that and build upon the face is to start dropping in the hair. The very first thing I want to do is go up to the top left of her hair, and that's a nice safe area where once I drop that in, I don't have to worry about my hand or the paper that's touching, the scrap paper that's touching the actual drawing paper. It won't smudge what I've already laid in. Instead of starting in the darkest bulk of the hair, I'm starting on areas that have the darkest shadows and also areas where individual hairs overlap the face and the background and stuff like that. That gives me a mental definition and a visual definition of where the hair ends and the background begins. And also notice this line that I put along her forehead. That's where her forehead rounds the corner and disappears, and the background hair butts up against that. I'm putting that in to give a more accurate definition of the side of her face, of her profile. And just that little line gives us the shape of her forehead and where her other eye that's not visible in the background curves around toward the camera. So we can see how the brow dips down. Then I can start from that line that I just laid in and work my way out to the rest of the hair. I've given myself a border to work outside of. I'm using a totally different technique to do this hair than I did on the original hair. So on this one, I'm starting from the darkest areas because I'm working on very dark colored hair. The individual hairs in this section will not be anywhere close to as defined as the blonde hair or the sandy brown hair that we did earlier. So on this one, I'm just going to drop in the darkest parts with extra soft charcoal first. That will give me landmarks to remind myself where I'm at within this hair compared to the reference photo. These shadows don't need to be exact, but I'm getting them pretty close to where they are in the reference photo so that I can tell that this is where the hair splits and goes back, and this is where the hair splits and starts curving forward. Here's where the hair goes from being straight to taking on those long, loopy, swooping curls. And as I add more and more of these very, very dark areas, then I can see where I can work my way out from those and start lightening it to show highlights and reflections. Because remember, we're not working with solid black hair here. It only looks like solid black because it's in black and white. In reality, the hair is more of like a very deep magenta, like a maroon type color. And it takes on a black appearance because of it, being in black and white, and because it's being contrasted to the hair that's on the left. The reason that's important to remember is because if we were doing jet black hair, it would have more defined highlights than what we're going to be adding in. and we'd be putting a much more blocky style to it with this extra soft charcoal. It would be much, much deeper, and it would fade less into like the thinner hair that happens on top and some of the swoopy hair that comes down before it becomes curls. Because the hair is so dark, I can get away with just flat out outlining the edges of these curls with dark charcoal. I'm still not using extremely hard strokes here. I don't want this to be really, really black. But I can get away with outlining with a fairly dark stroke here because the rest of the hair that I'm laying in with the pencil is about that shade of very, very dark gray and almost black. So by the time I'm done, you won't be able to see the outlines that I've created that will blend in with the rest of the hair that I'm drawing. By doing the outlines the way that I'm doing them, especially when we get up into the bulk of the hair that's, up on the top right, that will separate each little strand of hair that's been meticulously curled to have sort of a ribbon effect. It all comes up into one mass as we get closer and closer to the top of the hair. But each one of these curls that go along the face and the cheeks and dip down into her shoulders at the bottom right part of the drawing that we'll eventually get to in this video, each of those creates an almost ribbon-like strip that separates in the main part of the hair. And underneath each of those ribbons is going to be a much, much darker shadow than the rest of the areas. If I can get those thrown in now, and I can get each of those ribbons separated, it will look like curled hair, and each of those little strips will have their own reflection, and they'll have their own little glints of light. That's what keeps those separate from the rest of the hair. If we didn't make a really big defined section of shadow there, it would all blend into one mass, and it would just look like her hair suddenly started to curl right around her ears. That's not what we want. It would make it look flat and two-dimensional. Since we haven't talked about, true landmarks for a while, that's the other thing it does. If I glance over at the reference photo right now, and then I glance back at my drawing, on the right-hand side of her hair in the middle, there's like two triangles that meet. There's one in the top and then one right below that connects to the bottom right part of the upper triangle. I can see those at a glance when I go from this to the reference photo and back again. It lets me know that this is where I'm at within the reference photo, so that then I can, if I move my way upward into the top part of the hair, I can look at those two triangles in the reference photo and then use it like a road map. And that lets me know where specific reflections lie, where other darker shadows are going to lie, and just kind of use that as a reference point to give you an idea of where you're at and where you're going. Now that I have a significant portion of this laid in, I don't want to get too far into laying in the hair before I start to smooth this out with a Q-tip. Because remember that even though these are like defined shadows, they're still kind of like a background piece. There's going to be highlights and shadows that are laid over the tops of this. So what I can do is I can go back in with a Q-tip and I can scrub these together, but I'm going to scrub for the most part in single lines, and I'm going to pull with the flow of the hair. The texture of the Q-tip is going to create a flow of its own. There's going to be parts of the Q-tip that are rougher than other parts, and pieces of the Q-tip that have more charcoal on it than the rest because the little hairs poke out further. Those are going to create their own illusions of hairs that aren't in true focus. So we're just going to kind of scrub. Sometimes we scrub, if it's in a really dark area, we can scrub in circles or we can scrub more generally. But once we get into ribbons of hair and places where we're going to see the hair kind of separate out and we can see more and more individual strands, those we absolutely want to go with the flow of the curls and those little strips. Notice that I'm pulling further than the shadow that I've drawn, and that's because those midtones are really important. The shadows are going to be less detailed. So all we're doing there is removing like those little pinholes that poke through the charcoal where you can see little white pinholes in the paper. We're getting those out of there, and then we're pulling the charcoal that's now on our Q-tip up into the rest of the hair to create a mid-tone base to work off of. Now whenever we go back into that here in just a little bit with a Tombow eraser and with the actual pencils itself, those we'll be able to see the darker areas that we're laying in and definitely the lighter areas that we're laying in much more easily because we've created a nice, soft, smooth background layer of mid-tone like dark grays. When I do the same thing on the left side where we have curls peeking out from behind her face and little strips of hair and curls that overlay the background, I can't go as far with a Q-tip because I'll have a big fuzzy blob at the ends of her hair, and that's not what it looks like in real life. As the hair gets thinner toward the end of the hairs, we need to switch to a blending stump so that can get much sharper, and those will look like clumps of hair that get naturally thinner as they get toward the tips and less like a big blob of just fuzzy gray. Remember, each of these things that we're laying in here on this left-hand side are not individual hairs. They're clumps of hair, and that's one of the reasons we don't just flat out draw those in with a pencil and call it a day. We need them to have a tiny, tiny bit of fuzziness to give the illusion that it's, say, 10, 15, 20 hairs grouped together that make that little spiky little hair clump that comes out on the left-hand side. And we'll do the same thing with the hairs that go across the forehead. There's like 2 or 3 of them that go across there, but we're in no way are we drawing individual hairs here. We're drawing clumps. Now this can get a bit tricky when we get up to where all this hair starts to meet. You're tempted to draw hair in kind of like here, like one mass, like all the hair flows this way, and it doesn't do that. Certain curls flow one way. For instance, the main curl that's in the middle that almost touches the corner of her eye, that flows down and to the left before it hooks back where the curl starts. The hair that's above that, there's another strip that comes out at like the crown of her head. That flows down and to the right. That's going to cover up yet another layer of hair behind it that's more of like a solid black because it's got so much shadow that there's barely any detail at all. Where the curls meet just to the left of that, it's going to change directions again. As long as we get the flow correct in each one of these curls, it's going to make it look like each curl is defined and is its own thing. But as we get toward the crown of the head where all this hair starts to meet, that's when we need to start making sure that things start to kind of fan out into more of a broad idea of hair. Because that is when it's going to start to flow one direction. But when you're doing the curls, you have to keep in mind it's like a roller coaster. It starts to swoop one way, then it changes direction here. And it can be a little bit difficult to keep track of what swoops where, of what changes direction in exactly the right places. That's why we have landmarks, and that's why we create certain sections of the drawing separately from the rest of it, so that that one thing that we drew in becomes our map. Now that we have this section of the hair done, which is, or not done, but at least way more filled in, I'm going to go back and use the same technique as I used before when we were working on the bottom part of the hair and those curls. I drop in a fairly large section of shadow that I know exists in exactly this spot. I do it somewhat roughly, and then I can use the Q-tip to blend that in and start pulling that charcoal out into the rest of the hair. As I get to like the apex of this curl that sticks out closer to the camera, I'm using just a little bit less pressure there in order to create the illusion that a little bit of light is shining on that area. Then this other section to the left of that, it's drawn in much rougher, and I can use the same exact technique here, and that will give kind of the illusion that there's a tiny bit more detail there. Because what's going to happen is, I don't know how well you can see this on camera, but in real life what happens is, I'm drawing individual little strokes that are kind of thick. And then when I blend that out with a Q-tip, those individual strokes will fade out into the new black area that I've just blended, but they'll still be visible. And so the fact that they're still visible creates the illusion that not only is the hair dark here, and not only is this particular section covered in shadow, but there are even darker shadows that clumps of hair make, that smaller like 10 or 20 hair clumps make. Now with the hard charcoal, I'm going to go in and just start lightly laying in more individual sharper shadows here. And that's going to make the hair look sharper detail-wise. If we continue doing what we were doing with, blending stumps and Q-tips and things like that, we could continue doing that and it would look fine. You could do a whole, head of hair that way. But in order to make this look really meticulously brushed and curled and sharper compared to the background, I can lightly lay in little pencil strokes here and there. I don't want to go crazy with these. I'm going to lay those from the darkest areas to the lighter areas and decrease pressure as I'm going. So, in other words, what I don't want to do is have dark defined lines right in the middle of reflections. I need those lines to be much lighter in the reflections than they are in the dark parts of the hair. You can occasionally pull one all the way through that, from the dark part through the highlights all the way to the dark part that lies, up above it. So from down to up all the way through. What that will do is create the illusion that there's a separation in the hair and that there's like a break and you can see through to the shadows below it. Those are totally fine to do. Don't go crazy with them or it'll make the hair look messy. But one every now and then will make the hair look more natural and have, those natural breaks that you see in hair. When I'm drawing around this nose, I'm taking extra soft charcoal and I'm using kind of a light touch because I want it black, but I don't want it jet black. The hair gets way thinner here, and you start to see more of what you would expect to see like as a beginning artist, which is drawing individual single strands of hair. It's kind of like that. The hair starts to fan out and you can kind of see through it. So I'm drawing individual strokes here and I'm using a light touch and I'm making very, very sure that I hug those right against the bottom of the nose. Because if I get these wrong and I say I go too far into the nose or too far outside of the nose, it will change the shape of her nose, therefore changing the shape of her face. So we have to be extraordinarily careful here to make sure those lines start and stop in exactly the right areas. And that's going to be the same thing that we have to keep in mind with every single part of her face. And remember, we still have an arm to do below that. And every part of her body that is closer to us, closer to the camera than that background hair. Every place where those two things meet, the hair and the foreground, we have to be extraordinarily careful to make sure that the background hair butts up against it in exactly the right areas. This is one of the most tedious, most difficult parts of the drawing because getting this wrong is going to be really hard to fix, and getting it wrong will again change the shape of her face and make her look like someone else. The easiest way that I've learned how to do that is to, instead of drawing outside of that area where they butt up against each other and then drawing to the butted up area, I start at the area I'm trying to not enter. So for instance, let's start on the bottom lip. Put my pencil there, exactly where I want it to be, and then pull down. That way I know I'm starting in exactly the right area and I don't have to worry about accidentally going too far into the face. You can't always pull that off, and it doesn't work in every situation, but for the most part, as a general rule of thumb, I find that's the easiest way to make sure I don't screw up the shape of face, lips, nose, things like that. One way to make sure that you're not over outlining a lot of this and making it look cartoony is don't use a really sharp point on your extra soft charcoal. If we want this stuff to look clumpier, more like strips and ribbons, if we use a tip on our charcoal pencil that is not really sharp, it's going to automatically make the line kind of fan out and be thicker and fuzzier on the edges. And that's really what we're looking for here. If I were to use a pencil that was much sharper on the tip, it's going to look much more like we just tried to, it's going to look like we took an ink pen and just tried to draw in individual hairs. And we're really not looking for that. We don't want a ton of definition here. We want some, but we want to make sure that what we're putting in right now is the basic idea of hair with sort of fuzzy lines along the edges so it looks more natural. Then later, when we do refinement, if we decide we need to sharpen those up, we can always do that, because we can take a sharper pencil at that point and just draw a line along the edge of the existing lines that we've already done, and that will naturally sharpen it up. But I use a pencil that's halfway between blunt and sharp. So like, I guess a good way to explain that would be, if you sharpen up your pencil as sharp as it would go, then you go over to a scrap piece of paper and you start scribbling splotches on the scrap paper and slightly turning your pencil as you do it. If you do that for about 5 or 10 seconds, that takes the sharpness off the edge, and that's about what I'm using. And it needed to have, for me and for this part, it needed to have just a little bit of a curve on the end of the pencil to pull off that sort of fuzzy, natural look. With these strips of hair that go across the forehead, this is where the hair starts to break up a little bit, and you can start to see thinner and thinner clumps of hair. The way that I blend that is, instead of using a Q-tip, just use a blending stump with a sharp point on it. At that point, all we're really doing is kind of taking the pencil marks out and smoothing it together so it doesn't look clumpy. This section right here, this curl that kind of sticks out, catches a ton of light compared to the rest of the hair. So what I did was I've kind of dropped in a basic idea of midtones with a blending stump to kind of break that up a bit. Then I do just a tiny bit more with a pencil, hard charcoal. Then I can go back with a Q-tip and start to blend that in a little bit better so that it gives the illusion of shadow without having a whole bunch of individually drawn lines in there. You can see that it's got kind of a flow to it. It has a direction to it, and that's what we're wanting. What we don't want to do is create that flow and that direction by drawing 50 separate lines down through there. On the top left-hand side of her hair, there is a strip that's much darker than the rest, and then reflections come off of those at the apex of those curves. So what I've done is I've kind of scrubbed in this little line that starts very thin at the top and then gets wider at the bottom. It also gets lighter at the bottom because the hair thins out as you get closer to her forehead. So I laid that in quick, and I didn't do individual lines. I just kind of scrubbed it back and forth almost like a scribble. Then I'm going to go back and add in and define the main curl that comes off of that. And now it looks like it comes up to that point and loops back in, like that's where the curl starts. Then I can continue that shadow along the same angle all the way across the top of her head. And I can pull little lines from that here and there to make it look like the hair still has a flow. But it all comes together at this point where it all kind of dips down toward her scalp and creates like a single thick line of shadow there. Now I just grab the Q-tip and I put it into the darkest part of the black in this area, and I pull toward the center. That way the outer edges of this whole section remain dark. I lay in a mid-tone of gray with the Q-tip, and that gets lighter as it reaches the apex of that hair. Now we're creating the illusion that it's reflecting light. We don't want it to reflect so much light that it's white, like that would make it look too jarring. But we do need it to be lighter than the outside edges of each of these this section. Now along her temple, this is where a lot of this hair starts to come together, but it doesn't come together at a point. The lines that I'm drawing all flow the same direction, but they don't meet at one little tiny focal point. It's kind of spread out. So if the top of this, if I'm drawing individual lines here at the top, as I get closer to the bottom, they kind of form a cone. So let's say the top part of this is 1.5 inches wide. The bottom part where all this hair starts to meet is like 1 inch wide, or maybe 3/4 of an inch wide. It gives the illusion that the hair, this is where all the curls are starting to come out of, but there's hair that goes underneath those main curls that we've already drawn. If we brought it all to a point, it would look weird, like there's just a piece of hair that just ends right there, and that's not what we want. We want it to look like it disappears behind the other curls. We'll have the same sort of problem going through the middle of the top of her hair. It all flows the same direction, but this is also where it starts to kind of break up and become curls. So we're going to do a section of lines with a pencil to lay in the main shadow here. And those are all going to basically be going the same direction. But as we get down toward the curls, they start to break off and curve a little bit more. It's not horizontal, but it gets close to horizontal as it gets close to the curls. If you watch the way I'm blending this and the direction I'm blending it, this is what makes it look like the curls are forming rather than have just been pasted on. If we don't have that flow together, and we have the hair going one direction and then just stopping, then the curls begin, it's going to look like the curls were just clipped on like a hairpiece. It needs to flow together and blend together. So rather than the lines going one direction, then suddenly changing directions into the curl, the lines will flow like a roller coaster track. Now I'm going to go back in with a Q-tip and start blending in these other hairs in the largest sections. I cannot get that correct with just a Q-tip when it starts to butt up against her face. And so I want to make sure that I get the majority of the big areas done first. Then I can go back in with a blending stump and get the sharper areas. Notice how extremely careful I'm being around the lips and around the skin whenever I blend these in with this blending stump. You can get away with making lines that flow along the skin. In other words, you can get away with kind of outlining the lips itself. If you do that, be kind of light with your touch so that your finished product doesn't look like the face has an actual outline. For the most part, you want to blend this with the direction of the hair and try your hardest to make that stop against the skin. It's difficult to do because the lines are going vertically and you're kind of blending in a way that instead of the lines going with the skin, they're coming right into the skin and stopping dead in their tracks. That's difficult to pull off. To do that on the bottom of the nose, what I'm doing is I'm making a horizontal line that's only like maybe a millimeter or two long and then pulling down quickly. That way I'm giving myself kind of an outline that makes sure that I don't go into the skin on the nose. Then when I pull down quickly, it makes a natural gradient that's soft. So now whenever you see the hair that comes down below her nose, you can definitely tell that it's breaking up, and the biggest, darkest lines there represent shadows of clumps of hair, and then the softer gradient that we're putting in gives the illusion that those are individual single hairs that are almost transparent. They're still dark, but they're kind of see-through. But the one thing we're not doing is drawing in each of those individual strands of hair. As we do the curl that comes across the bridge of her nose and that comes across the tip of her nose, that's way easier to do. So you can see I'm using much quicker strokes here because that flows with the same direction of her nose. So I can use that more like I'm outlining the edge of her nose. That's way, way easier to pull off. The one thing to keep in mind here, though, notice that as I'm laying in this very black section of hair that's right by her nose, in comparison to the darkness of that strip of hair, her nose looks almost totally white. It looks like I've not put any gray on that whatsoever. But we know that I did because you watched me do it with a Q-tip, right? The brain is being tricked into thinking that that nose is much lighter than it actually is because there's a direct comparison to the hair I'm drawing beside it. Because of that, we will likely have to go back in with a Q-tip and add some charcoal to that to darken that up. Otherwise, the contrast will be so dramatic that it will make her nose look flat. Now notice how sharp the pencil is that I'm using right now. That's because in order for this hair underneath the nose to look like it starts to fan out and get really thin, these lines do need to be a lot more defined. I apologize for repeating this so often, but I am not drawing individual hairs here. I'm drawing clumps of hairs that give off their own little shadow. That perspective is extremely important to keep in mind, because if you start thinking about this as individual hairs, you're going to go crazy with those lines and put way too many of them in there, and it's not going to look natural. I'm starting to feel the tediousness of this setting in at this point, because it's real easy to get overwhelmed with something like this. So what I've done is I've kind of left that section of hair alone for right now. And I'm going to bounce up to an area that I know if I finish this part, it's pretty much done. This section would be pretty much done. I want to complete another finish line so that psychologically I feel like I've made an accomplishment, and this drawing will give me more motivation to continue going and to keep at what I'm doing. If I kept going in that specific area that I was working on underneath the nose and I tried to perfect that all at once, that tediousness is going to set in so bad that I'm going to start thinking of this like a job. I'm going to look at it and think, oh God, I've still got so much more to do. I do not want to do any more of this section. So instead of doing that, just refresh your brain, get up to another section, find a place that you know if you can get this little part knocked out, that section of the paper will be done. For these little stray clumps of hair, these really thin clumps that come out, I'm barely touching the pencil to the paper. That's going to make those strokes look grainy, but I would rather them look grainy and then I have to blend them out with a stump later than to put them in too dark and it just looks weird. So I'm barely touching those to the paper just to give those little clumps a starting point. And I can take a couple practice swings in the air to make sure my direction's right. Then I'll go back in with a sharp, pointed, thin blending stump, and I want to start taking out pencil marks. As I'm doing this, the blending stump is becoming dirtier because it's pulling off charcoal from the paper. I can take that dirty blending stump and use it to my advantage by dropping in some very quick strokes that represent other stray hairs that are kind of popping off at the edges of the overall hair. If your paper ends up landing on top of something dark that you've already drawn, don't slide it away. Pick it up and move it because you're going to smear the charcoal. Look down every once in a while too at the scrap paper that you're resting your hand on. And if that starts to get too dirty and too much charcoal on it, and it will, flip it over to the clean side. And the reason I folded it in half is because once that clean side gets dirty, now you fold it in the opposite direction. You just unfold it like a greeting card and fold it backwards. Now you've got two new clean sides to work with. Once you've dirtied up those clean sides, then throw that away and get a brand new piece of scrap paper, fold it over and start from scratch. This is an area where we'll be laying down that scrap paper a lot onto very dark charcoal that we've already drawn. So it's going to get very dirty very fast, and we don't want to pull that charcoal into another area of the drawing. So if I slide that black charcoal over the face, I'm going to create streaks, and it's going to ruin everything that I've just done and take a really long, tedious amount of time to fix. As each of these curls on the outside of her face start to get thinner and thinner, I'm going to use lighter and lighter strokes with a pencil, and then make sure that I take care of the tone and the contrast with a blending stump. The lighter the stroke I have there, the more control I have with a blending stump, and then I can kind of manipulate things with it. So now that I've gotten those little stray curls and stuff behind her head done, I can go back into, these are still background curls, but they're a little bit more foreground than the others. And I'm going to start blending all those together and get this particular section of the drawing done. And now you can see that her face is starting to take on a lot better shape than what it looked before. Because now the blackness of that hair becomes the defining feature that outlines the lightness of her face. The only shadows that I'm blending with a blending stump in this thin section of the hair are the darkest, thickest shadows. That's what's going to make it look like clumps of, 10 strands of hair here, 15 strands of the hair there. The darkest shadows have their own presence, I guess. Now, to make sure I've got a little bit more control over the darkness and the depth of the blacks in this hair, I'm going to switch to hard charcoal for some of these thinner curls. It's not as black. What I can do is I can lay in the shape and the direction of the hair with hard charcoal and know that I'm not going to get too dark. Then if I happen to need to darken this up later, I can go back in with extra soft charcoal and add those darker shadows. But this outer section of the hair like this, it's important that we don't get too dark because this section is going to start capturing more and more light. It's going to get thinner and thinner. And it's what's going to create like a variation in the tones of her hair. I can do some touch-up work with a Q-tip too. So I'm going to go back into the thin strands that are below her nose, and I'm going to add just a little bit of individual hairs or the illusion of that by pulling down very, very lightly with a Q-tip. Then I'll kind of smooth out some of the other strands and then go back up into the top of her hair where it meets the scalp. And there are some shadows and some thinner clumps of hair that's almost fuzzy. I'm just going to very quickly add those in with a Q-tip so that I've got that idea there. We can refine that later, or we could really even leave it like that if we wanted, but I desperately needed to pull that hair down into the forehead so that her forehead didn't look as long and her hair didn't look as thin. Once I have all that done, then I just go back to what I was doing, which is defining this curl that's on the outside and the background. The edges of those curls and then the tops and the bottoms are all darker than the very, very middle. And that makes it look like it's giving off its own little reflection right in the middle of the curl. It makes it look like it swoops out and toward us. If we had it all the same color, it would look flat like a silhouette. Now this is the most interesting curl to me because the outside edges of it we're seeing dead on. We're seeing that the edge of that curl travels vertically, which means that we're going to be able to see the edges of those hairs kind of poke out from the sides of it. Then the lines that go across that curl are almost totally horizontal until they get to the right hand edge. Then they start to curl back up or curve back up. This curl also has a fairly dramatic reflection in it. It's the first one that's really starting to look shiny and reflective. So what we do is all of our strokes are going to be horizontal. And we're going to make sure that it's way darker on the edges than it is in the middle. And then the very bottom part of that curl is also going to have its own sort of drop shadow. So we need to make sure that's kind of dark too. Then we blend all that together with a Q-tip, and very, very lightly, we're going to pull over that little white spot that we left in the middle. And notice just within a few seconds, that suddenly looks like it curls out toward us, because it's reflecting a fairly dramatic point of light right in the middle of it. The darker we make the edges and the lighter we make the middle, the more shiny and the curvier it will look. When we blend it with a blending stump, we follow the direction and the flow of that hair. So we're going to blend horizontally. And all I'm doing there is, once I have the outside edges blended, I can pull that dark charcoal toward the center to make it kind of spiky as it reaches that center. And that will make it look like the hair kind of splits and has individual shadows of clumps of hair that travel over that reflection. We don't want to get rid of that reflection entirely. We need to pull a few of those hairs into it. But for the most part, we want to leave that very center part to be kind of light. Not pure white, but you can see it now as I pull away, that it has its own reflection, but it's not so dramatic that it is like distracting. Just to add them in and kind of fill up a little bit of the blank space that happens in the forehead, I'm going to start dropping in very small clumps of stray hairs. And what I'm doing is I take a sharp point hard charcoal pencil and I very, very, very lightly, the pencil's barely touching the paper, I just drop those in along the sides of the little curls and the swoops of hair that fall down over her face. But as I get toward the hair that sits on top of her head, I'm putting a lot more of those lines there because the hair there will be thinner and there will be much more individual hairs there. So I drop a little bit more of those in than what I'm going to do if I were just working on the curls. And remember, they don't all just come straight down. There's some of them that swoop over the top of each other. They kind of go in different directions because hair naturally gets just a tiny bit messy in that area. And they just kind of go crazy and do their own thing. They still basically follow the same, flow as the rest of the hair, but these go just a little bit wilder than the rest, and you can throw in some that have a different direction than the others. And if you're sparing on the amount of hairs that you do like that, it will make it look more natural because that's just the way hair works. The only time I really follow the reference photo here, and I don't try to get it exact, but I try to keep in mind some of the major hairs that come out, especially when you get like over the eye. There are certain hairs that kind of cover over the eye, and you want to kind of mimic those from the original photo because those will actually interfere with the shadows that exist below them. And so from the original photo, if I looked at the right hand corner of her eye, there's kind of a darker shadow that happens there, and it becomes extremely hard for me to tell what's a hair, what's curls, what's an actual shadow, what's makeup, what's eyelashes. It all comes to a point right there. If I can drop the stray hairs that are in that area and and match them fairly strongly with the original photograph, I can mimic what's going on there, and that takes care of that confusion for me. At that point, I don't have to know what that little dark section is because I'm mimicking what the photo told me in its own language. In the rest of the hair, especially when you get toward the top and you get along the outside edges that bleed into the background, you can kind of go crazy and do what you want with stray hairs there because that's not going to matter. But when they interfere with a major focal point and a major detail of the drawing, I personally tend to try to match those as close as I can. Again, look how light her face looks now that I've started adding in all these extra black marks and all these stray hairs and the darkness of all these curls. It just makes her face look flat and white. And you saw me put the gray in there earlier in the video, and you saw how dynamic the shadows looked when the hair wasn't laid in. But now that it is being laid in, by comparison, it makes all the rest of that stuff look flat. So I know for a fact I'm going to have to fix her skin tone and the shadows at some point. At the same time, because I know that I'm going to have to fix all that, I have to be kind of careful about how many of these extra stray hairs and these extra little swoopy bundles of hair I lay into her face now. Because whenever I darken up her skin tone and I darken up the shadows, I'm going to be using a Q-tip. And since I'm going to be blending in large areas with a Q-tip, when I blend into those stray hairs, it's going to naturally make those lighter and fuzzier because the Q-tip just will fan out the charcoal in that area. There's some areas I don't mind that happening. Other areas I do mind it happening, so I have to be mindful of where I put those and predicting the future a little bit and telling myself this area is going to have extra stuff in it. So let's wait until we darken up the skin tones and the shadows and then go back and lay in those extra things. When we get down into these curls that happen along the middle and bottom part of her face, along the jawline, they're going to start catching more and more light. There's a second thing that I do here. It naturally catches more light, so we're going to make sure that the middle parts of those curls are a little brighter. But as we go down, the second thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use a style that I like that I mentioned in another video, where I get a little bit rougher and a little less detail as we go toward the bottom right-hand corner of the paper. I do it in the background, and I do it the further away we go from the face, because that's just my personal style that I like to use. So as we go down the paper just a little bit later, we're going to use some just straight up witchcraft to create some of these curls very quickly and very dramatically with big bright white reflections in them. But before we get there with those, I need to make sure that the curls that are in the foreground in the focal point section of the drawing, especially in the middle section of the drawing, those ease into those less detailed, brighter reflections that we're going to put later. So there's a little bit of planning ahead of time here, where as I work down the paper, the reflections become more and more dramatic. Now remember the tedious thing we talked about earlier? When you start to lose motivation, you want to move to another area that you know you can fill in. That's what we're going to do with this arm. We are very quickly going to drop this in, and that's another part of the style that I mentioned in another video. In the background, I like to use what I call dirty realism, which is throwing something in very rapidly and putting very little detail into it. So all I want to do is give the idea of her arm coming out there. So I'm just going to drop in a big old blob of gray to represent her arm, and I'm going to leave those pencil strokes or the Q-tip strokes in them. That way it looks rough and drawn, and I need to make sure that this particular section is darker than the rest of it, because it's capturing way more shadow than the rest of her whole body. It's capturing more shadow than just about anything in the entire drawing. So I'm going to drop this in very, very quickly. She's got a tattoo that we also want to keep fuzzy, because I don't want to try to recreate a tattoo. And if this is a tattoo on something that's fuzzy and out of focus, then it also needs to be fuzzy and out of focus. So we're just going to do what I talked about earlier. We're going to very quickly drop this all in here in order to help boost our motivation and get another large section of this drawing completed. So that way I'm looking at less and less white paper, and that finish line is right there. We're almost ready to start sprinting toward it. Once we have that all laid in, very fuzzy, especially along the edges, then I'm going to bounce back up into the hair. So now I've kind of taken care of that tedious feeling that comes over you whenever you're doing all these curls and you start to see the complexity of them and it gets kind of overwhelming. I've taken care of that by bouncing to that arm. The added benefit of doing that is now much more of the paper is covered. And now when I look at this drawing, I'm not seeing so much the complexity of all the curls I still have to add. What I'm seeing is there's just a small corner of the bottom right piece of the paper that needs to be filled in. And that's much easier for me to mentally handle than looking at it and thinking, oh my God, I've got like 5 or 6 more major curls and there's all these extra strands of hair that pop in and out, and how I'm going to keep track of all that. And it's starting to feel like a job and I don't feel like doing it. I get that out of my mind by doing something else, crossing another, mini finish line. Now I can bounce back up with a fresh mind and fill in the rest of this stuff. Once I get so much of this hair done, I'm going to start comparing the hair to the skin tone to the rest of the drawing. And so occasionally I'm going to jump back up and darken up things like the forehead. I'll darken up some things like, the way the cheeks roll and things like that. Since I've completed pretty much all of the parts of this drawing except for the remainder of the curls, this then becomes the thing that I jump to when I need to kind of refresh my motivation. It pulls double duty. I can use that for a motivational, springboard, but it also needs done at some point. And so I can knock that out and start to refine those areas. And now I'm on like an upper level of refinement. I'm getting very close to this being like finishing touch level of refinement. Look at the difference between the forehead now compared to the cheeks and the nose. It's now starting to look like skin, and all that gray is starting to come back into focus because now compared to the hair, it's becoming like noticeable. So without the hair, we could see all those shadows just fine with no problems whatsoever. Once the hair's there, our brains are tricked into thinking that that's white paper, and we cannot have that. Another level of refinement that we need is making sure that the shape of her face is correct. So, for instance, I noticed that her nose was a little bit too blocky looking on the end. And the way I take care of that is to grab a blending stump and just pull some of that dark hair into the areas that I need to thin out. So I'm smoothing out the hair that's behind her nose, and also I'm modifying the shape of her nose at the same time. Now remember that as you do things like darkening up skin tone, and you're doing like final touches, I say the word like a lot, I apologize for that. In fact, some of you probably didn't even notice, but now you will forever. Anyway, keep in mind that whenever you lighten or darken skin tone, it's also going to affect the shadows that you already have on the drawing. So if I'm going to darken skin tone, there's a very good chance that I'm also going to have to darken shadows. You can notice a direct contrast now between what I just did, what I've already drawn, and her lips. Remember when I first added those in, they looked natural. They looked like lips. They had shade and they had gray to them. But the same problem happens with the lips as what happens to the skin tone. As I add darker and darker elements to the drawing, the lips by comparison look lighter and lighter. And this will happen all over your drawing. If I got the details on the hair and the entire woman on the right, if I got those too dark, By comparison, the girl on the left would look too light, and I would then have to go into that entire section of the drawing again and darken up all that area. So it's not just her hair that I'm looking at compared to her own skin tone. It's the entire creation on the right hand side, comparing it to the entire creation on the left hand side, and also comparing both of those to the background. Everything connects to each other in a drawing like this. And so you need to make sure that you're aware that if one thing needs to be darkened, how is that darkening going to affect the rest of the drawing? We don't want this to look like we drew the thing on the left, then drew the thing on the right, and drew the thing in the background, and then just pasted all those things together. This needs to look like all the same drawing that happened by the same artist at the same time. It needs to have the same style, and it needs to be cohesive. The only way to pull that off is to constantly compare what you're working on to what you've already drawn. If it needs to be corrected, even if it's tedious and you need to do the entire drawing needs to be darkened, then so be it. It's gonna suck to have to go back into all that stuff again, but your end result is going to be so much more worth it whenever you get everything that flows together and everything looks like it's the same style. Now that I know I'm getting closer and closer to the finish line on this, the ultimate finish line where we actually sign it and seal it, I'm adding a lot more refinement than I normally would. Like if I were just starting this out and I just started with her face first, I probably wouldn't be putting in a lot of extra hairs on the, that are flowing off and breaking away from her head and all that. I probably wouldn't add those in right now. But because I'm getting close to the end of this drawing, my mind is now in the frame of mind of finishing, of ultimate refinement. And so I'm kind of allowing myself to do that tedious type refinement and the fine hairs and things like that, because I want to be in that state of mind that, holy crap, we're almost done with this. If I'm in the frame of mind that we're almost done with this, I am naturally going to start adding finishing touches as if I'm on the last leg of the drawing. It's just a psychological thing that happens with me. It may not happen with you, but I think that if you're this far into the drawing, if you do happen to get into that mindset, I think it's fine to go ahead and indulge that. If you've been waiting for the thing to happen that I mentioned earlier when I said we're going to get into some straight up witchcraft, this is right about the area where we start doing that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start adding in these curls and make sure the shapes are correct. And then I'm going to go add the darkest parts of the shadows, and I'm not going to get into extreme detail here. I'm going to keep the main shadows in very, very dark. I'll add in a bit of a midtone, and then what I'm going to do is take a Q-tip and just zip right over the top of this. And that Q-tip will create the illusion of individual hairs, and we're going to have a pretty bright, glaring reflection that happens here. It's not going to be as defined as the curl that happens below this once I finish this one and get down to the next ones, but it has a flow to it. So the reflections that happen in the main part of the hair above this have pretty defined reflections, but this one's going to jump right out at you, and then the one that I end up putting below this one will be even more dramatic and even whiter than this one is. Now that I've got those little strips drawn in with a pencil, I take the Q-tip, which is just really loaded up with black charcoal, by pulling it across what I've done in extra soft charcoal, like right on the paper. I blend that in, and then I just pull that Q-tip across the area that I left white. One quick little zip across the area, and now that reflection is there, and it's like bam. That's to me, even having done this for, I don't even know, more than 40 years, that to me still feels like witchcraft. That's as close to Bob Ross as we're going to get with hair. This is the part where you say, like he would say, we'll drop in a tree by just tapping our brush here. That's our version of that. We're going to create hair just by zipping that Q-tip across that area very quickly, and then bam, hair. We can always go back and touch this up with the blending stuff, which we're going to do. We're just going to pull from the darkest part of that black charcoal and pull it out into the reflection so that it looks like some of those little clumps of hair are not perfectly even with each other. They don't sit on a flat plane. Some of them break off and they're a little further into the distance than some of the ones that are on the apex of that curl. Some of the ones have shadows that jut out into the reflection because they're broken up in a different way. It's fine to do those. We need a little bit of randomness to this curl to make it look real. So don't be afraid to like dive into that reflection and break the plane of that reflection with some darker shadows. That's what's going to make that look a little bit more natural. This is where I noticed that the hands, the fingers look too stubby. And so I mentioned this in the last video, that to get around that, to make this hand look more realistic and the fingers look like they're not stubby, all I do is take a loaded up or a slightly dirty blending stump, and I just start refining the lines along the edge of her hands and along the edge of some of those shadows. Then I can just take the little places where her fingers meet and pull those down into her hand a little bit more, and that makes her fingers look longer. It doesn't take much to do this, so you don't have to put very dark defined lines there. If you just pull that down even lightly, it's going to give the illusion that the fingers have grown by, I think I go about a half an inch here. I go down pretty far. Even that slight little touch up there, look on her first two fingers, on her pointer and middle finger, they now look like they're the correct length rather than just stopping mid-knuckle like that. And I barely put a line there at all. I barely touched that blending stump to the paper. Now we create this curl the same way that we did that major one that's got the brighter reflection. This happens to be an area that I'm not comfortable, or an angle that I'm not comfortable drawing in. I don't like to push the pencil at like a 45-degree angle going up and left. So I'm a little bit careful on that one. I get the basic idea of the curl in, and that way I'm sticking to the style that I like to use, where I give less detail as we go down and away from the face. But I drop that in really quickly, knowing that we're going to add some definition to it with a Q-tip and with a blending stump just a little bit later. Then instead of sitting there and harping on that one curl, I bounce out and get another section of the drawing done. Because right now we're starting to wrap up all of these curls, and we'll be done with this drawing very, very shortly. Now, the one thing that you do not want to do right now, if you notice that the majority of the drawing is done and I have a very, very small section of the paper to fill, it's very tempting at this point to just start drawing 1,000 miles per hour just to fill it in and get it done. Make sure that you're not doing that. Take your time and get these right. It will become glaringly obvious if you start dropping those things in as fast as you can drop them. It's going to have not just less detail, which we're actually going for in this section. It's going to look like you just dropped it in just to finish it. Other artists are going to be able to tell. Your viewers are going to be able to tell, because it's not going to look as realistic in that section. And so make sure you take care with the final minutes of your drawing. Take as much care there as the rest of the work that you've done. Yes, it's nice to get that stuff done and out of the way and call it finished, but you'd much rather have as much care here as you did at the first of the drawing, even if you're using less detail in this area. and blend the sides of the curl and pull right toward that reflection, and bam, just like that, it looks like hair. One thing you may notice, I didn't notice it at the time, but I noticed it later and then fixed it. I have a magic curl that's just floating out in midair. It's that one on the bottom left. That actually has a connecting strand of hairs that goes up underneath her chin. And whenever I was doing the outline for this, I forgot to add it. And so once I get this a little closer to completed, I notice it, and then I can add that little strand of hair to connect it to the rest. Otherwise, it's some sort of summoned hair, summoned by a hairbender. Now, the remaining curls through the rest of her hair on this bottom right are going to be pretty easy to do. Again, I know I've mentioned it several times, so I apologize for the repetition. But there's purposely going to be less detail here. But naturally, on this bottom right hand corner, the shadows are going to be way less defined because they're in darker shadow and they happen to be catching brighter reflections. So the contrast between the dark darks and the bright whites are going to be much more dramatic, and the detail that happens in this area is just naturally less. So I can drop in a curl with just kind of a solid, well, not really solid, it's more of a broken line of curls. So this little thin curl that starts right at the tip of her chin and drops down, that's kind of the same tone and contrast all the way down. It's just drawn a little roughly. Then we'll blend that in with a stump or whatever, and just a little bit the same way we did with the rest of her hair. But the point is, the reason I'm rambling like that is I don't have to put as much effort into defining clumps of hair in this area. The only thing I really need to do is there are 3 or 4 curls that overlap each other in this area. So I need to make sure that those come across as their own defined entities. Fortunately, that's pretty easy to do. I just outline each of them the same way we've done the rest of the curls. We just don't do it with as much detail. Then I'll go back and do the little witchcraft zippy trick with the Q-tip. The other thing to keep in mind is now that we're doing these little clumps of curls that get thinner on the bottom, they're all going to share basically the same tone. And so we don't really have to worry much about overlapping these pencil strokes. As long as we have the shapes in there, we don't have to worry much about, for instance, one line looking like it overlaps another, because those will naturally blend in whenever we use the stumps and the Q-tips and all that. So what I'm doing is I'm drawing a little swoopy line for one curl. I draw another swoopy line for another curl, and I'll just shade right over the top of another one. It'll give the illusion that they kind of weave in and out of each other. So I'm not too concerned about getting those exact. I'm more concerned about getting the shape correct and getting the tone correct more than anything. Notice how much quicker my strokes get when I get down to this corner. That is purely psychological. I can see this as being the last part of the drawing that needs to be filled in, and then that means that all my paper has something on it, which means the finish line is right there. This is me in sprint mode. Normally, I would tell you to slow down, take your time, and treat this, well, I just did tell you that just a little bit ago. Treat it like the rest of the drawing. Psychologically, it's hard for me to get past that, so I just start drawing quickly. Now we're going to work on this big long curl, this cylindrical curl. I blend in the sides of it, then I just pull that extra soft charcoal right into the middle of that reflection. Now notice I'm not going to spend a ton of time here putting detail. That by itself, for me, looks cool. One of the other things I'm doing is, notice how on the rest of the curls that are up by her face, I used a blending stump to blend the edges. The curls that are down here, I'm using just a Q-tip. I don't think I go back over it with a blending stump. And if I do, it's very roughly. Because I want those hairs to have sort of an out of focus, faded edge to them, like a fuzzy edge. So to accomplish that, I just go over it very quickly with a Q-tip, and that creates that fuzziness. And now that we're almost done, every shadow of every curl, every highlight of every curl in this section is done the same way. Drop it in fast with extra soft charcoal to make it really black. Then put your Q-tip in that black charcoal and pull toward the reflection. Do it lightly though. So I'll put more pressure while I'm in the black area, and as I'm pulling, I release a little bit of pressure as I get toward the middle. So I'm sort of making a swooping motion where I'm pulling it across the reflection, but I'm also pulling the Q-tip up away from the paper just slightly to decrease the pressure as I get toward the middle of those reflections. That way there's more of a gradient that goes from very dark black to bright, lighter reflection. And now with the blending stump, I can go back in and take out little pencil marks and the white pinholes, and I can kind of start to refine this area by adding just a few hit and miss shadow type of highlights here and there. Now to make that look less rough, all I got to do is same thing I did with the Q-tip, except now I'm doing it with a blending stump. I'm starting in the dark area and just pulling it over into the light area. I'm being very stingy with the amount of those lines I put in because I don't want to add too much detail. I just want breaks in the hair, and that's it. Remember when I said we're going to be comparing the entire drawing to everything else we've drawn? Now's when we go back, and this is the ultimate level of refinement. Now I can go back into the entire rest of it and find the places that desperately need darkened up. I need the tone on the left to match the tone on the right and vice versa. So I'm going back over her eye and increasing the contrast on the shadows on the tips of her eyes where it bridges into her nose. And that little tiny itty bitty touch up already added some depth to this section of the drawing. So in looking over the drawing and comparing and contrasting, I'm looking at every single detail. And I'm trying to figure out if there's anything that jumps out to me as being off. And one of the things was the magic curl. It popped out at me. It's what I would suggest before you totally finish a drawing is step away from it for at least an hour. And in fact, I would suggest stepping away from it overnight. And then when you come back the next day or after a few hours, all the things that are wrong with the drawing should pop out to you as needing fixed. You should be able to look at it and go, oh wow, this is definitely not dark enough. And also I have a magic curl floating here, so I need to fix that. So I quickly add in the rest of this curl, and now it's connected to the rest of her head and looks natural. And the last thing for me to do on this drawing is to do major last level refinement. We're now getting into touch-ups. The first thing I notice is that the shadow underneath the curl that goes across her cheek is not even close to dark enough. So I'm going to start adding in some major refinement with those shadows, and that shadow also flows underneath her bottom lip, which is going to give the lip more depth. Then when I dive into her chin, I also notice that the tone on the shadows of her chin are almost the same exact tone of the arm that's behind it in the background. So what I'm doing is I'm taking the Q-tip and kind of doing a horizontal outline on the bottom to separate those two areas. And if I want to separate them even further, all I have to do is darken up one of those two areas. Either darken the arm behind it or darken the shadow on the bottom of the chin to create separation there. Even if it's not in the original photo, we can create that. But I kind of fix it quickly to where at least I'm semi-happy with it. Then I bounce back up into the rest of the face, and I'm going to start correcting darkness issues, contrast issues, shadow issues, and that mainly boils down to it's time to start darkening everything. And not just darkening it a little bit. We're doing like finishing touch type of darkening, where once I finish this area, or once I start using a Q-tip in this area, I'm going to continue doing it until I'm happy with that shade. We can look at it later, and if it needs fixed again, we can again fix it. But I'm going to get pretty damn close on every section of this skin. Now, even though I'm darkening this entire area, I am doing it with a light touch. I mean, I'm having to increase the amount of charcoal that gets on the paper quite a bit, but I'm not going overboard and just diving in there and going crazy with it. I'm using a light touch, and I'm making sure that my strokes are smooth, and I'm going to build up to a darkness value that I'm happy with. Take your time. Yes, you're at the finish line now, but if you start to rush at this point, you can really mess up the drawing. So take your time and make sure it's a slow and steady wins the race sort of deal. Take note of how dark we have to get around her eyes to make it look like makeup. It makes me curious to know if those of you who wear makeup, I wonder if it's easier for you to draw a subject who's wearing makeup because you're used to applying it on yourself, or if you have the same trouble drawing makeup as I do. I wouldn't say I've got trouble drawing it. It's just I have to take a lot more care in order to make it look like makeup. Because there's something that happens where, like if you're drawing a subject that doesn't have makeup on, you know what's a shadow, you know what's an eyelash and what's a highlight. But then when you put makeup on a subject, you're dealing with all those issues plus the texture and the tone of makeup as well. So it's very hard to get across when you're drawing in black and white, but it makes me wonder how many people have issues with that and how many of those people use makeup themselves or don't use makeup. I would think it would give you a slight advantage over, like me doing this, but who knows? I'm just taking wild guesses, wild stabs. Now this is already a pretty dramatic improvement over what we had before. Her face no longer looks like it's just white paper bleeding through. It's starting to look like skin. The shadows are starting to pop out and look a lot more real than they did before. It's just dropping in the things you need to fix, taking a breath, maybe stepping away from it and looking at it, and then make those fixes. And we're almost ready to sign and seal this one. I'm going to load up the scrap paper with extra soft charcoal again and get my blending stump loaded up with that as well. And I want to make adjustments to the eyelashes here because as I'm adding more makeup and shading to that with a Q-tip and with blending stumps, I'm actually decreasing the amount of blackness that's on the eyelashes. So instead of drawing those back in with the pencil itself, this also needs to be a little bit on the fuzzy side. So I'm using a blending stump to correct those, and then the little ridge line that happens on her eyelid. I'm correcting that with a blending stump as well because I want those lines to be soft. And I lost about 12 minutes worth of video, but all I've done in that was darken up a little bit more, refine a little bit more, and now I'm taking a paper towel across the entire background of the image, and I've dirtied that up a tiny bit with my scrap paper, and I'm darkening the entire back by using this. Now that does two things, two important things too. It not only darkens the entire background, but it also, with that scrubbing motion or the little zip motion that I'm doing here, that actually makes it look fuzzier in the background. So it adds blur as well as darkness. And all I'm doing is I'm keeping the same stroke line. I'm going vertically from the bottom up. And that way, if there are any stroke lines to what I'm doing, they're going in the same direction and it will look uniform. Now the areas that I couldn't get with the paper towel, because that's a really broad thing to use, I'm just going back with a Q-tip and butting that up against the girl's head so that there isn't a big old bright line that I had missed. It needs to flow. It needs to look like it continues on behind her head. So I just used a Q-tip to make that uniform. We're now on final touch-ups. This is pretty much it. There's a small shadow, very, very thin, that almost outlines her forehead and then kind of dives up into her hair just a little bit. It's subtle. It's not like a solid outline. It's more like a faded line that's a little bit darker just on the edge of her head. By adding that in, it makes the reflection that happens in the middle of her forehead, it makes it stick out a little bit better. So I'm just taking a blending stump, added that in real quick, and then dropped a few stray hairs along the left-hand side right above her ear. Then I'm going to go back into her bottom jawline and very subtly start defining some of those areas with a Q-tip. And I'm not doing much here. I'm just darkening up those areas just a tiny, tiny bit to create separation between the jawline and the neck. Then I'm going to go back up into the shadows along the side of the jaw and darken those up a little bit, because look, when you compare her skin tone to the skin tone on the right, it's a little bit flat looking. Not much, but it's enough that I'm going to notice. So I'm just going to darken that up a tiny, tiny bit with a Q-tip, and then we're almost done. We're like in the final couple minutes of this drawing. Part of what I'm doing on her face isn't just darkening up either. Keep in mind that part of what I'm doing is also blending the really dark areas into the really bright areas, because we don't want to have every reflection on her face be a really bright white. We need a lot of those to be really subtle. So as you get toward the tip of her face along the outside edge, those are a lot brighter. But the ones that are on the sides of her cheek and stuff, those are way more subtle. So as we're darkening the shadows on her face, we're also kind of pulling that into some of these harsher reflections and taking the edge off of those. And that should just about do it. This is all ready to sign, and I will take it out in the garage and seal it with fixative. I'll have to do a video on how to do that at some point. But that is how to draw a human portrait. In the future, we'll do one that's more head-on. But for right now, I wanted to start you out with something that was from the side, because really the proportions are easier to get. But I really hope you enjoyed these videos. If you are interested in joining the art guild that I've started, it's totally free. I will leave a link to that in the description. Also, I'm just getting ready to start making my Patreon public. And so if you'd like to be a patron and help support this channel and get more of these videos and videos like it, really appreciate the patronage. And then if you'd like to join the Discord, go on the guild website, and on the join page I have a little link to the Discord. And there's a bunch of us that hang out in there. Super nice people, incredible artists. Anyway, so happy to have you with me, and I will see you on the next video.